what most of the international community, certainly the West, wants to see is the Palestinian Authority playing a role in Gaza. Where does that leave Hamas, for example? I mean, they are still there in Gaza. They're not going to disappear. I mean, even in the occupied West Bank, to be honest, frankly, there haven't been elections in a long time. If there were elections, Hamas would win.
I do not think that this Israeli government wants a deal. They don't want any kind of Palestinian state. They do not want any kind of credible Palestinian leadership because they see their strength as coming from Palestinian weakness and Palestinian division. And that is the way Netanyahu has always played it.
Donald Trump, he's of course straight out of the box yesterday before the deal had even been announced, crediting himself with his extraordinary diplomatic powers. What game is Trump playing here? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. A ceasefire deal has finally been agreed between Israel and Hamas after 15 months of appalling carnage. So why has it only just happened now? Does it have anything to do with the soon-to-be President Donald Trump and what happens next for Israel and, of course, for the Palestinians? To discuss all this and more, we have international editor Lindsey Hilsum and our foreign affairs correspondent Secunder Kermani joining us from Tel Aviv. Welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Secunder. What's the mood like there today? And does everyone agree that this was really down to Donald Trump and his Middle East envoy breathing down Bibi Netanyahu's neck?
Well, look, in terms of the mood, we saw celebrations in Gaza last night, people waving flags, coming out on the streets, cheering. We then also saw Israeli strikes continuing because the ceasefire isn't coming into place until Sunday. I had thought, and perhaps others in Gaza had thought, that there would be a de facto cessation of hostilities until then, but dozens of Palestinians have been killed overnight. I saw one video of a young man shaking or looking on at the body of his younger sister who had been killed, saying, "Wake up, Hala, wake up. The war is over." So the war is still not over. And there are, of course, fears that potentially this is not necessarily the longer lasting end to the war that everyone hopes it will be. Here in Israel, the mood is also one of cautious. There's this mix of hope and anticipation amongst those Israelis, the many, many Israelis who are so desperate to see the Israeli hostages returned back home. But there's also a sense of dread that perhaps something could still happen that would scupper the deal. We might be able to reach the first stage of this deal, which would see 33 Israeli hostages returned over a 6-week period in which there's, of course, an end to Israeli bombing. But perhaps we might not reach the second phase, which would see the remaining hostages released in exchange for a longer lasting ceasefire. So everyone's very much kind of in this mix between hope and fear.
I have to say, I don't think I've ever covered a ceasefire deal that didn't involve more fighting before the actual ceasefire started. So I'm not that surprised by it. Lindsey, Donald Trump, he's of course, was straight out of the box yesterday before the deal had even been announced, crediting himself with his, extraordinary diplomatic powers. But, he's not entirely wrong, is he?
Well, I think that what is happening is that the arrival of his envoy, Steve Witkoff, has is turbocharged these negotiations, because the deal, as I understand it, is pretty much the same as the deal which was on the table in May. Now, the Israelis are always saying that it was Hamas that held this up, but actually the far-right members of the Israeli cabinet, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, have boasted that they were the ones who held this up until now and didn't let it happen. And they're still saying that they don't like it. But then you ask the question, how could Trump and his envoy push this over? And maybe there is some kind of bigger deal going on, because we know that the far right in Israel wants to annex the West Bank. It wants far more settlements. It wants to go against many decades of American policy there. And Donald Trump, I don't think he certainly doesn't care about the Palestinians. He might be in agreement with that. And so maybe there is some other kind of deal which is going on as well. We don't know.
Are we certain that, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the finance minister, both, on the extreme side of the cabinet, will pull out of the coalition? And if they do, does the coalition then fall? And does there have to be another election or maybe a minority government?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, it seems that that Netanyahu will be able to get the vote on this agreement through the cabinet, because the vast majority of the government, the cabinet, are in favor of it. Indeed, the vast majority of the Israeli public are certainly in favor of it. But you're dealing with these two far right parties who are members of the coalition, only commanding, between them around 10% of the vote, but really wielding this undue, huge political influence in Israel because of the coalition nature of the government. As Lindsey said, Ben-Gvir boasting that he has personally prevented a deal taking place on a number of occasions in the past. He has indicated that he will leave the government. There's questions remain about whether Smotrich, the other party, religious Zionism, would also leave the government. The current noises that we're hearing are that he certainly opposes the deal, but that he is willing to go along with it and not leave the government on the condition that after the first phase, the war is resumed. And that's why I think, after this initial 6-week period, that's where the real test is going to be. And we've heard that in the past from Netanyahu when we talked about these previous iterations of this deal. Netanyahu seemingly scuppered it because the Americans and were saying, yes, we're not going to give a written assurance that the war will come to a complete halt, but we are going to do everything we can to ensure that it does. And Netanyahu came out publicly and said, very belligerently, we will keep fighting after a temporary pause. And that of course, sent a very clear message to Hamas that, well, you're giving up, as they would see it, their biggest form of leverage in return for not a permanent end to the war. That's always been the fundamental disconnect between the two sides. And that disconnect may, unfortunately, rear its head again after the first phase.
But you have to consider that the vanity and the reputation of Donald Trump here as well. And Lindsey, as much as you and I know Donald Trump and the soul of Trump, he'll be very upset if after 6 weeks or 5 weeks into his term as president, second term as president, suddenly the fighting resumes again, and people will say, "Well, what was that all about?"
Yeah, I think that's true because he wants, he said there'll be all hell to pay if this war doesn't come to an end. But 6 weeks is a long time in international politics, and he's going to have Ukraine on his mind, and he's going to have all the domestic stuff on his mind as well, trying to deport all those foreigners that he says he's going to throw out of the country. So the Israelis may feel that they have enough time to play with. I think the other question is, what advantage would the Israelis gain from restarting the war? Because obviously, if they did just restart the war, that would indicate that they had negotiated in bad faith at this point. And also, not all the hostages are going to be released in this first phase. There's supposed to be 33 released in the first phase. Women, anybody over the age of 50 and so on. But there will still be others, soldiers and younger men and so on. So I don't think that Hamas is going to give up all of its bargaining chips.
Do we know, Sek, what Trump's team or Trump himself actually said to Netanyahu last weekend? Because I know there was some raised eyebrows because Steve Witkoff was in the region, I think, on Friday, and then rang up the Prime Minister's office and said, "I'm coming to Tel Aviv tomorrow morning." They said, "Oh, you can't possibly come. It's the Sabbath. He's going to be busy on the day of rest." And they said, "Well, we don't really care about that. We need to see him." And then they did meet, and that's when those words were spoken. Do we know anything else?
Yeah, I mean, fascinating details about that conversation and unexpected, really. I mean, when you look at Steve Witkoff's history, I mean, he's a real estate tycoon. He's
a Jew from the Bronx, but he's got a salty tongue, apparently.
Indeed. And I see people crediting that kind of unorthodox background with being a straight talker, someone who's willing to put up the ante and really raise the pressure on Netanyahu. I mean, I think what also will have definitely been a factor is that whilst the Biden administration was there, Netanyahu would have been looking and thinking, well, I've always got the option of waiting to see what Trump does as and when he takes power, and perhaps he will be more on board with the idea of continuing the war. After all, I mean, you look at the kind of language he was using on the campaign trail, it was all very pro-Israel. Yeah. It was very much about, Hamas must be destroyed. You look at the confirmation hearings that have been taking place, you hear the same kind of language from senior figures who are going to be part of the administration.
Mm.
But clearly, Trump has not deviated from his call for an end to the war before his inauguration. And what Lindsey was saying about the difficulties that the Israelis would face in resuming the war, I think, very much hold, and not least because so many members of the Israeli public would be outraged, because there is a very sizable majority of people here who want to see this deal going through to its conclusion. They want to see everyone come back. I was speaking to the father of one Israeli hostage, a young male soldier who would only be released in the second part of the deal just earlier today. And he was saying, look, we are going to be, we are continuing to fight on the streets. We're going to be raising all the public pressure that we can and trying to, speak to other international players, including the Trump administration, to try and keep the pressure on the Israeli government to make sure that goes through.
What game is Trump playing here, if he's playing a game at all? Because on one hand, he's got Mike Huckabee as his ambassador to Tel Aviv, or I should say Jerusalem, because of course they moved, bits of the embassy there last time he was president. He refers to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. On the other hand, we know from the Abraham Accords and from Trump's own sort of declarations that he is desperate to do a deal which involves the Saudis and Israel. But of course, the Saudis will only come on board if there's something in it for the Palestinians. And of course, at the end of all this, Trump sees himself very much on the south lawn of the White House, the way that Clinton was, with the Palestinian leader to be determined and the Israeli prime minister, whoever that will be at the time. And then, of course, the big ceremony in Stockholm for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I'm sure he wants because Obama got one and he wants one as well.
Look, there's a contradiction at the heart of the Trump policy on the Middle East, and I think you've just really explained it. So on the one hand, Trump and the people around him are very much in favor of settlements. They would like to annex the West Bank, which is what Smotrich and Ben Gvir and other members of the right in the Israeli
All
government.
of it or just some of it?
Certainly, some of it, a large part of it. I mean, when you look at the West Bank now, it's no longer any kind of contiguous piece of territory which the Palestinians could easily have as their own state, because the Israelis have made sure that it's completely divided up by roads which only Israelis can use and settlements put in very strategic places and so on. It's always been that, but ever more so now. So it's very, very difficult for that to be a proper Palestinian state. And so, yes, they would certainly like to annex large parts of it. So that is one part of the policy. But the other part of the policy, as you say, is a grand bargain involving Saudi Arabia. And Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who is the power in Saudi Arabia, he's not going to agree to the total end to all Palestinian hope for their own homeland. He's just not going to agree that, partly because of loyalty to Palestinians, but also, many Palestinians would be extremely skeptical about Gulf support, but also because of his own population and the wider Arab support for the Palestinian cause. And so that is the circle that Trump has to square. And at this point, I think it's very hard to see how that works.
Sek, let's talk about the Palestinians here, and especially Gaza. I mean, do we know what plans there are for the governance of Gaza if and when the Israelis finally leave? What about reconstruction? Who's going to pay for the reconstruction? And once some of that has started, who's going to be running the show? Is it going to be a new version of Hamas? Will it be Fatah? The people running the show in Ramallah in the West Bank? Tell us what you know.
These are all key questions, but and key questions that basically we don't have the answer to. I mean, in terms of the scale of the challenge, it's huge. I mean, Israel's assault on Gaza has been one of the most ferocious in history, certainly in modern times. So I was looking at statistics, and it's 2/3 of all buildings in Gaza are either destroyed or damaged. 40 million tons of rubble and debris that are being created by that. There are estimates that it would take years and years and years just to start clearing that away, let alone rebuilding. Of course, you've seen this huge attack on the healthcare system, universities, everything there. So the scale of the challenge is huge. Added to that, I mean, what most of the international community, certainly the West, wants to see is the Palestinian Authority, who are in charge of part, or help administer at least parts of the occupied West Bank, playing a role in Gaza. Netanyahu has always been categorical in opposing that. That seems to be a red line for him. It's been one of the kind of the key points of contention between him and the Biden administration. We saw Antony Blinken, just the other week, laying out a plan for the future of Gaza, which would involve the PA, would involve support from Gulf states who would be, sending money, perhaps also contributing security forces to help resolve the law and order situation, which is one of the key obstacles in delivering aid right now, as well as just the sheer amount of aid that is able to cross in. But where does that leave Hamas, for example? I mean, they are still there in Gaza. I mean, we saw last night, there were images of some of their fighters on the streets, masked with their guns, taking part in the celebrations. They're not going to disappear. I mean, even in the occupied West Bank, to be honest, frankly, there haven't been elections in a long time. If there were elections, Hamas would win.
Well, that's the impression when I was there last. That's the impression I got in Ramallah, in other parts of the West Bank. The last time they had elections was, I think, 2006. If they had them again, Hamas would probably wipe the board.
I mean, that might not happen in Gaza. I mean, we hear from people. Obviously, Israel bans us from being there on the ground ourselves as international journalists. But it seems that there's, people on the ground there have a lot more resentment to Hamas for their role in this conflict. So perhaps they would not win. But certainly the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, are not particularly popular in any case. But trying to square the circle of working out who would run Gaza in the future if it's not the PA becomes very difficult. I mean, you speak to the Israeli right wing, and their ideas seem, frankly, totally farcical, of some kind of international mandate of countries, or maybe moderate Arab states. But where does that leave any Palestinian agency? What kind of Arab country would want to be seen as doing effectively the job that the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is doing in the West Bank? They're accused of being collaborators with Israel, of cracking down on what many people see there as resistance forces. Would Egypt, the UAE, want to risk being portrayed in that kind of role? It'd be disastrous for them. So,
and Lindsey, I mean, we know that the Saudis are probably prepared to write a very large check for the rebuilding of Gaza, and maybe the Gulf states as well. But they will want to know who's going to be running the place. I'm sure they won't want to do it themselves. Who do you see in charge of what's ever left of the Gaza Strip at the end of it?
If I could see who was in charge, maybe I'd have a powerful position that I don't have as a mere
I'll
journalist.
give you the job, Lindsey. I'll give you the job if you want it.
But I think, well, Secunder's just been talking about, how the PA is seen as basically as the Israel's cat's paw in the West Bank, but also corruption. And the PA is unbelievably corrupt. It has been unbelievably corrupt over many, many years. And that is the reason, back in 2006, a long time ago, when I was in Gaza, the people voted for Hamas rather than Fatah, because they saw Fatah as corrupt, and Fatah is the PA. And it has only grown more corrupt. And the idea that you're going to have billions of Gulf money coming in order for the PA and Fatah to what? Steal it? I mean, I can't see anybody who's going to think that is a good idea. And so I have no idea who can possibly run Gaza. And unless you have some kind of new force that comes up. And I'm very interested in what Secunder was saying, that you could still see Hamas on the streets last night. I was reading something today which said that the Israelis thought that Hamas had at the beginning of this war about 30,000 fighters in 24 brigades. They still think that they have more than 15,000 fighters. Now, many of those fighters will be new fighters because they have killed an awful lot. New fighters who, as yet are inexperienced on, but there's still quite a lot of fighters. The other thing that shows, if those statistics are correct, is just how many civilians have been killed. And that's the other thing which I think we shouldn't lose sight of when we're discussing the strategy and so on, is that people in Gaza are in deep mourning. There is not a family that hasn't lost someone, and many have lost, nearly everybody. And so we need to deal with a population that is unbelievably traumatized, extraordinarily angry, still very, very deprived. I mean, they're talking of getting aid in 600 trucks a day to come in, bringing in 200,000 tents and 60,000 temporary homes and so on. But you're going to get all of these people going back to what were their homes in northern Gaza, in Gaza City, and finding that they have nothing and no prospect of anything. So governing a people like that's incredibly difficult.
Of course, and all the scar tissue that's accumulated over the, not just over the last 50 months, but even before that. I mean, yes. the PLO would obviously say that they're not corrupt, but I have to say, even if they say that, frankly, the impression that I got on the streets of various West Bank cities was that people, though, were really fed up with the people who've been running them for quite a long time, and they just don't think that, the people in the West Bank have got, the government there has got a mandate anymore. And the question, I guess, is the PLO courageous enough to go to the people at some stage and say, we're going to have an election and we're prepared to deal with any nasty surprises? Just finally to both of you, and I'll start with you, Lindsey. I mean, when I spoke to Gershon Baskin, the former hostage negotiator, one of the most optimistic Israelis left in Israel, and there's only about 6 of them, he said, that it is the darkest hour before dawn. This has been so terrible, but it is so bad what's happened in the last 50 months. And there's been so much suffering on both sides that actually there has to be something positive that comes out of this. There has to be what he likes to call the Belfast moment, where we end up with a sort of Israeli-style Good Friday agreement. And of course, what he's talking about, like Biden, maybe even like Trump, although I've not heard him say it, is the two-state solution. Is it possible, do you think, and I don't care whether you're being optimistic or pessimistic here, Lindsey, but just be realistic, that we get something like that, some horizon of dignity for the Palestinians that will involve self-determination like we haven't seen ever before at the end of all this process? First you, Lindsey.
If the Israelis wanted that, I think it might be possible, because Israel is in a very powerful position now. It's more or less destroyed Hezbollah in Lebanon. Assad has fallen in Syria. Their arch rival Iran is fundamentally weakened. The Palestinian problem is leadership, but there is a potential leader, and his name is Marwan Barghouti, and he is in prison. Now, if in this prisoner swap, swap of prisoners for hostages, Marwan Barghouti was released, there might be a possibility of Palestinians rallying round a leader who has said, and has said to me, because I interviewed him in prison, that he wants a deal. The Israelis say that he's a terrorist, but he says that he wants a deal. That's what he's always said. So you can see that kind of potential scenario. I, however, think it is highly unlikely that the Israelis would release Marwan Barghouti, because I do not think that this Israeli government wants a deal. They don't want any kind of Palestinian state. They do not want any kind of credible Palestinian leadership, because they see their strength as coming from Palestinian weakness and Palestinian division. Right. And that is the way Netanyahu has always played it.
Indeed. I was going to say, that's the way he's always rolled, isn't it? Let's be honest.
Always.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu is, I remember him last year coming out and taking credit for having blocked the creation of a Palestinian state. In fact, in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, though, there was a vote, not necessarily legally binding, but nonetheless, very indicative of where even opposition members voted in favor of a resolution saying that there should never be a Palestinian state. And I think that unfortunately speaks to the current mindset that there is in Israel right now, where, just as I was arriving, into Tel Aviv the other day, there was a Israeli passenger on our plane coming in from London who had overheard my conversation with other colleagues and said, before before October the 7th, she said, I thought that there was the possibility of us living together, and even if it would have been difficult. And now, I no longer see that after in her words, what they did to us on that day. And the trauma of October 7th is still very present for Israelis. And, by the same token, I mean, let's talk about the trauma of the people in Gaza. I mean, you talked about the sheer number of people, of entire families that have been wiped out, of children who have been orphaned. I mean, I think it's something like 19,000 orphans or children with at least one parent who've been killed. What's that generation going to grow up thinking? I mean, if you look at the trajectory of Palestinian resistance, as they would see it, to the Israeli occupation, it's increasingly got more violent. I mean, the first Intifada was, largely by contemporary standards, fairly peaceful, sticks and stones. Second Intifada was, we saw many more suicide bombings. October the 7th, more Israelis killed in a single day than the whole Second Intifada. The trauma that has been inflicted upon the people in Gaza and also in the West Bank. I mean, not to the same extent, but record numbers of people killed in the occupied West Bank by Israeli forces. Huge numbers of Palestinians there in detention. Many of them not facing, or certainly not convicted. Many of them in what's called administrative detention, so they're basically detained indefinitely. What is this generation going to grow up thinking? It seems hard to envisage them also.
I mean, the one thing I would add to both of you is also that, for something like the Good Friday Agreement to happen, for something like the Belfast moment to materialize, you need kind of honest political leadership that both sides can trust. And I just don't see that at the moment. I think, it's possible that the Palestinians will trust Trump a bit more after having, breathed down Netanyahu's neck, but maybe not if he's got people like Mike Huckabee as ambassador, in Israel. So I think all those doubts that we've just discussed and that you so brilliantly outlined are the things that probably prevent some honest broker from coming forward and saying, we need to do this deal, because if we don't do this deal, it'll be a forever war for both sides, until the end of time, and we can't have that. So I'm not sure whether we're there yet, but I mean, the next few weeks and months will be really, really fascinating. And there'll be so much drama unfolding as, Palestinians return to their bombed out houses, and prisoners are let out of Israeli jails, as the hostages return to their families. And we don't really know where the emotion of that unleashed political moment will lead us to, but it would definitely lead us to another really fascinating podcast. So Lindsey, Hilsum, Secunder, Kermani, thank you very much to both of you. That's it for the Fourcast. From me here, Matt Frei. I'll see you soon.